Hello, welcome to PSR, People Speaking Rail. We are those people. I'm Mike Baudendistel. I'm joined by Joanna No Turkey Marsh. Call you No Turkey because you worked straight on through Thanksgiving. Apparently, published an article. This big CSX derailment on was it Wednesday, just in time for Thanksgiving. So, how disappointed were you when you saw that CSX had a derailment and you're going to have to publish something on your holiday?
Yeah, I just kind of expect it, kind of par for the course. It's like, yeah, so it was fine. I mean, well, for me, selfishly, it was fine, but although I'm sure CSX wasn't very happy about it, and nor probably other people involved in the situation. I'm sure everyone, of course, obviously would not wanted the derailment happen to begin with. So there you go. But
Yeah, well, they run the trains 24/7, 365. So, the
Mhm.
railroads don't take a holiday. So I guess that's true of the railroad journalists as well. And it is kind of just striking. I mean, you talked about this morning on FreightWaves. Now, what strikes me is just how similar this was to at least what initial thoughts are based on the Norfolk Southern derailment at East Palestine, Ohio, where wheel bearing heated up. The most recent detector, which has it at 170 degrees. It was not 170 degrees, so I didn't catch that. And like my whole life, I've never worried about wheel bearings on rail cars until this year. And it just seems to me that like there's got to be some kind of regulation that comes out of this, just because these incidents have been high profile. I mean, the East Palestine one in particular that really made the rounds on social media. And I know you're following a lot of the safety legislation that may or may not come out by the end of the year, may come out next year. What are you hearing on railroad safety legislation?
Yeah, yeah. So it's interesting. So I should be having a story coming out this week on the prospects of rail safety legislation. Um, what the prospects are, I should say, on a rail safety legislation coming out in 2023, of which I think there will probably, by the time the story is posted, will probably be about 2.5 weeks, really, because you have this week and then the following 2 weeks in December, and then I think I think and then I think they are on recess like the week before Christmas, and so there's not enough time. Uh, it's interesting because some of the some people on the Hill had mentioned sort of people who actually worked on the Hill were reluctant to say anything one way or the other beyond, that it's in the hands of Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer of New York to put the vote on the floor, or put the bill on the floor for a vote. People who observe what's going on in the Hill, in essence, as you would imagine, say it's an uphill battle, and that's unlikely that a rail safety bill will have passage this the next like 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks. So yeah, so we're kind of looking at 2024 essentially, and then a little preview. I'll also be writing another story, which will be for later in December, about sort of the prospects for 2024 and beyond, for rail safety legislation. But that's where we're at right now,
Mhm.
which is kind of kind of
Yeah,
there.
it's hard to get much accomplished in 2 weeks in Washington, D.C. So it does seem like it's going to be the 2024 event, but I'd be surprised if there isn't something. I mean, I don't think they want to lap the annual, the anniversary of the East Palestine, Ohio derailment, not having done something. So my guess is by then the FRA will have something in the works. So we'll look forward to your article there. You also had an article on the 22nd about the Surface Transportation Board extending the additional feedback, the timeline to submit feedback on the proposed reciprocal switching rule. It's interesting. We've had a number of shippers or shipper interest groups on this show, and we've asked them, what would you like to see come out of Washington, D.C.? And the thing they say most often is this, reciprocal switching rule. Now, this proposed rule, the shippers would say does not go far enough because the service has to be poor for 12 weeks. Well, what if it's not? What if it's poor for less than 12 weeks and you can't do anything? And then it only addresses instances of service failure, not just economic issues where a lot of times the rail shippers feel that they're being overcharged simply by the fact that they're a captive shipper to one railroad. So it doesn't address those issues. The shippers say it doesn't go far enough. Rails say, well, it goes too far, not clear what the service requirements are. They have to invest in all this collection of additional, data. I think they probably have the data. They just don't want to share it. And then, concerns about the efficiency of the network, which could lead to other disruptions, which, if there was rampant orders of reciprocal switching, I would sort of agree with that. But my sort of perception is just kind of having the threat of a reciprocal switch would be enough to change maybe the service levels on some of these in some of these corridors. At least, not have an extended service disruption. I mean, there's always ways companies will game the system if you tell them that they're going to be ordered to have a reciprocal switch. If it's 12 weeks of poor service, it might mean the service is poor for 11 weeks. The interesting thing I thought from your articles is that unions, the unions said that they would rather the Surface Transportation Board focus on other things, focus on the common carrier obligation, and not focus so much on reciprocal switching. And then they said it could impinge upon workers' rights if they're away from home more than they otherwise would be. So that was incremental, to me. Did that surprise you? And have you heard any other surprising comments on reciprocal switching?
Yeah, I think, I think that kind of surprised me a little bit as well, because I think even though, well, I guess, you think about the service meltdowns in 2022, and in a way like that, the shippers and the unions kind of came together as like, as one force, and sort of, going before the Surface Transportation Board and asking them to, put some pressure on the railroads. So, that argument about, how it might affect, the how it might affect, the workers' rights was interesting, and something. Well, one I just hadn't really thought of. I hadn't really heard, about that point, but also, it kind of it's it's just an interesting perspective in general, just because, I mean, I think and for me at least, you kind of hear between, the case laid out for and against, with the shippers or the railroads, but you don't really hear about the other stakeholders involved. And so,
Mhm.
I think, which I don't want to say it's a silent majority necessarily, but,
Mhm.
the other voices that, the other parties that might have, a stance on things, but might not have said so publicly. Yeah, it, it, it is interesting too about the question about the common carrier obligation, and of course that related issue of competition. I think,
Mhm.
I've heard that there's there's a possibility that that question of competition, and then perhaps as well the common carrier obligation, might be addressed in a separate, um,
Mhm.
rulemaking, or some sort of separate proceeding. But of course, the big question mark now is, STB Chairman, Marty Oberman, who has been kind of, uh, pushing for these things, isn't planning to be on the board anymore, and so that kind of
Mhm.
raises the question about, like, how does this affect the momentum of, of not only reciprocal
Mhm.
switching, but of course, defining the coming better defining the common carrier obligation, and rail competition. So, um, everyone's just kind of wondering what's going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, that's one thing that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet is Marty Oberman's, not seeking another term as STB chairman. And I mean, we've both been following the rail industry for a long time, and there just hasn't been an STB board member who has been as aggressive as Marty Oberman has been. I mean, it seems like maybe he's been harder on the railroads, maybe tough but fair. And there's a picture of Marty Oberman. Does not capture his bow tie, and the way I've described him in the past is he's a pit bull in a bow tie. But he's taken up some of these issues like reciprocal switching, like wants to have a better definition of the common carrier obligation. He was also, I think, the person who pushed most hard for the railroads providing more service data, and it looks like they're going to have to continue to provide that service data. Also, I think was a big part of ordering Union Pacific to have that service order to Foster Farms, and a lot of these things that the previous iterations of the Surface Transportation Board. I mean, maybe it was just because the railroads were not as far along in terms of their in terms of their efficiency improvements and their margins and all those things, but they just were not as aggressive on the railroads. And it seemed like Marty Oberman, the way I would describe him, is he's tough but fair and took the job very seriously. And the people who thought that the Surface Transportation Board was a paper tiger that really didn't do anything, I don't think that applied to the Surface Transportation Board, under his chairmanship. And so my sort of question ultimately is, does his leaving change the board so significantly that it's just not the same agency without him? I mean, he'll be replaced, presumably by another Democrat, someone that Joe Biden would appoint. But is he someone who can truly be replaced? Because I just don't think that there's a lot of people who are sort of that tough, who would take the job that seriously, that would really have such a deep understanding of the issues as him. The Class 1 railroads are not going to be sad to see him go, but I think maybe some of the shippers are, some of the union leaders are. But what are your thoughts on his departure?
Yeah, I mean, it really is hard to say, because on one hand, you're right that he did encourage a lot of that momentum, and I think it was a surprise to probably everyone that he wasn't, that he wasn't seeking reappointment as chair, but two, that he wouldn't even be on the board. So there is that big sort of, that big gaping hole, it feels like, and then within that big gaping hole is a big question mark. I wonder, though, at the same time, too, how much, in a way, how much of an issue it will be as well, because for the most part, even though Marty Oberman has led the charge on these issues, most of the time it's actually the decisions have had the backing of the other four members, of the two Republican appointees and the two Democrat appointees. And so there have been a few instances where the vote wasn't unanimous. And those were kind of along party lines in a sense. I mean, you have Robert Primus, who is probably the closest to where unions and maybe some shippers think STB should be taking reforms, because he's argued his dissents in some of the recent decisions have been calling for ways to encourage rail competition and potentially better define the common carrier obligation. But then you've also had the Republican in some decisions, notably the one between the Navajo coal exporter and BNSF. There's a question like so in that situation, the coal company wanted more BNSF trains to export coal, and BNSF said we didn't have those trains available, and so it was kind of going back and forth. And then there was that question about the common carrier obligation in that proceeding as well, and the two Republican members, Patrick Fuchs and Michelle Schultz, had voted against Oberman, and that proceeding, in terms of compelling BNSF to encourage, or I'm sorry, compelling BNSF to give more, supply more trains to the coal exporter. Kind of arguing again that question, that proceeding shouldn't be used. Shouldn't be the lightning rod for defining the common carrier obligation. And so, like, on one hand, you do have those differences of opinion, but on the other hand, there has been, some unanimous consent. So I think, to their credit, it seems like each of the board members sincerely want, some sort of, want those rail shippers addressed. And of course, it might, they might differ on where those remedies might lie. But
Mhm.
I think I think they're I don't want to say I don't think anyone's going to be slacking necessarily on
Mhm.
the on STB related rail issues in 2024. It's a very long
Yeah, I
agreement.
think that's true. I think it's also maybe someone, no, the next person is not going to be as use as language that's as aggressive. Like a good example of that is just go read John Kingston's article from Railway Age, or not Railway Age, from Rail Trends, where we wrote up that discussion that Oberman had, and basically criticized Jim Vena's new CEO of Union Pacific's first several moves, things like the furloughs and the layoffs, and all of those things. So it was really quite the debate in there, with what Union Pacific has been doing. Their Union Pacific's president said they were disputed that there was any delay of maintenance, and that they're spending plenty on capital investment. And there are certain places that's hard to staff, but Marty Oberman said, okay, there's some positive developments there, as I think John Kingston highlighted, elsewhere. And he wrote another article also about green shoots in the industry, where he talked about how the rail service has improved, but at the same time, really, Oberman went after Union Pacific CEO pretty hard. It's a little hard for me to imagine some of the other members of the STB doing that quite as aggressively. Whether that ultimately translates into different policy making, I mean, maybe it is just a question of how one person presents themselves in some of these public forums. I mean, all we can do is listen to these public forums. Oberman sometimes kind of monopolizes the discussion a little bit in terms of the questions that are being asked. He seems like they ask the most aggressive questions to the participants that are asked to testify. But we'll see, ultimately if this changes much for the railroad industry. With the last few minutes here, I want to go through a couple of things from Sonar, which is the FreightWaves data product. You have a Sonar chart on intermodal volume, which I think this ties in well with John Kingston's article the other day on green shoots in the industry and service getting a little bit better. And so you see the white line is domestic intermodal volume. It's all domestic intermodal volume, but the white line is 2023 domestic intermodal volume. And you see how it's maybe a little bit below 2020, which was a really unusual year in terms of tight transportation capacity and lots of transportation demand. So just slightly below 2020 levels, and actually pretty nicely above last year's levels. I have fourth quarter, a quarter to date, domestic containerized intermodal volume up 4.2% year over year. So was a strong October and into November, and would attribute that to a little bit of a pickup in freight demand that was ahead of what we saw in some of the other modes. Trucking industries had a challenging October and November, and then also the improvements in rail service. Heard a lot of good things on rail service lately. A lot of the shippers that we talk to say that they really haven't had the issues with congestion at the terminals, haven't had a lot of delay days, haven't had any issues sourcing containers. And we've heard particularly good things about CSX, but really across the board, rail services has improved. And the data that Surface Transportation Board has been collecting bears that out. Now they collect all this new data on intermodal delay days, and those have really been pretty minimal. Another thing that goes into that chart is then it's been aggressive pricing by the intermodal carriers. So the intermodal contract rates have come down in response to the loose truckload market. And our data in Sonar shows that in the third quarter, intermodal contract rates, excluding fuel, down about 17% year over year. Versus the third quarter of last year, and that's a little bit worse than what JB Hunt reported. JB Hunt reported around 14%. We saw it down a little bit more. There were some of the shippers that we've talked to just put some of their intermodal contracts out for bid, which tends to happen either late in the year, sort of let's call it fourth quarter and first quarter. And some of those shippers came back, said that the bids came back with rates down 30% on average, and that the asset-based carriers were down more than 30%. So presumably those asset-based carriers, because they have lots of containers, they want to keep those containers utilized, and that's why they've been more aggressive on the pricing. So all those things were pretty significant, for that. And also hearing that shippers are using intermodal maybe a little bit more. I mean, part of that's because the service has improved. So no longer, do we have what we had during the pandemic, which is that during the pandemic, heard that there were some shippers that went into the terminals and pulled their containers out, get them, basically deramped them to move them on the highway because the service was so poor. Haven't heard any of that lately. In fact, I've heard the opposite. That some shippers have, when there's enough in inventory, have moved to intermodal on some things that had been moving truckload. So it's been a little bit of a recovery, I think, in market share. And then also heard that some shippers are being approached more by the domestic intermodal companies to use more intermodal, including some retailers and some shippers that really traditionally had not used intermodal, that had been sort of strictly truckload. So these are shippers that I would describe as ones that are moving apparel and other items that are really sort of strictly made overseas and primarily come in through the port of LA Long Beach. Those shippers being approached by multimodal carriers and say, hey, let's try to move some of this on the highway. And also think that another thing that's supporting intermodal volume has been a little bit of a shift back towards the West Coast ports rather than the East Coast ports. The issues with the Panama Canal, the water level issues, the Panama Canal has been driving some of that. In the fourth quarter number, where I said a minute ago that domestic intermodal volume, I have up 4.2%. On the international intermodal side, I actually have it up 7.3%. So those are loaded international intermodal containers in the fourth quarter. So primarily 40-foot containers. Those up 7.3%. And then we have this other data series in Sonar, the IOTI, which is shipment volume at the point of origin. So primarily China, have those up 4.2% in the fourth quarter. So it is, the intermodal volume are being supported a little bit by just more volume coming in through the West Coast. A question that we get a lot is how those rates compare to truckload, and have a Sonar chart queued up on the intermodal contract savings index. And so what we're looking at here is two different indexes. The one in white is looking at intermodal transactions that are processed in the last 2 weeks and the difference, including fuel surcharges to the truckload carriers. And the purple line is the same thing. It's just looking, the transaction have been processed within 56 days. And it shows that the transactions kind of processed in more or less real time. Looks like it's 9.3% reduction. The ones that only looking at the ones that have been processed after 56 days, or 16%. So what that sort of shows us is that intermodal savings, when you include fuel for both modes, versus truckload, these are on the same 5-digit origin destination pairs. Sort of is sort of in that traditional 10 to 15% range, roughly. The reason why that purple line is higher, I think that's weighted towards the bigger shippers, who would be the ones that would extend out payment terms, past 30 days to something like 60 days. And they would not be included in that white line where the rates are much closer to truckload. So based on that, the savings is roughly similar, but talked this morning on FreightWaves Now about what really moves the needle in terms of modal share gain, and I really do think it's service levels, where if the intermodal service levels can be where they need to be, that's what'll cause share gain, like moving containers from Newark to Chicago. If you can do that every third day consistently, that's solid, but it can't be 2 days and, sometimes in 5 days and other days.
Hmm. Yeah, and well, that's sort of the argument that the Class One railroad CEOs are trying to push, that our service levels are improving, so come back to us. So yeah.
Yeah. And they do seem to be improving. I mean, we'll see if there's a snowstorm or polar vortex in Chicago that'll put a wrench in things. But those will be some of the stories we'll watch, and then we'll watch, Joanna, for your articles on railroad safety that you're working on. And hope everyone has a good day.